I want to welcome everyone here to our second session, and again, very appreciative of the Secretary and the Department of Commerce for all of the great help you've been providing, and also just the commitment that's been delivered. I mean, doubling the size of the personnel in Africa over the last 24 months is got to be one of the biggest signals of change that you can imagine on the resource side, given all the constraints that are going on. That's just one of the many dimensions. I think the Secretary will talk more about that. We are going to have a number of guests, as I said. Ambassador Rice will be here, Ambassador Froman, and I believe the Secretary of Transportation, Fox, will also be coming, and so we'll introduce them during the day. We have a pretty packed agenda. We're going to be going through 8 of the latest recommendations, and Karen and I will both be sort of introducing each one. We're going to be pretty disciplined on keeping the time frame. I do hope that we're going to be able to get time for input, because I think some of the recommendations still need some work as we go through it. I think we should be very open about, we're all collectively working here to make these as high impact as we can, so let's not be shy about where we want to push things. We've also included a couple of pages, which you'll see under your blue file, which is a ranking again. We'd love to get input from the council members of the ranking of the 8. If you just allocate 100 points across them, it just helps us get a sense of the priorities. And then we've also have a feedback sheet for each one, and the real focus on how can we make them more specific and even more actionable, and then maybe some other comments that you want to make as well too, but that's something, as you're listening, we would appreciate you all going through. As you know, last time we met was in April, about 6 months ago. A lot has been done. I'm not going to go through that part on the recommendations that were made before. We have these 8 that we're going to cover. We have an important trip to Africa at the end of January to Nigeria and Rwanda, where we want to make sure that we are as prepared as we can to make the most out of that trip. But basically, the one point I would just say is our time is running out, and I think there's an urgency I think we should have here in terms of the impact that we want to have, and I think we should also realize that we're not going to be able to get 25 things done. This is when I usually shut up when you come in on these. And so I think the point we want to make is thinking about things in 5 years from now. If we look back at the impact of this committee, what are the actual things that we've made a difference on? That should be our bar, because we just don't want recommendations. There's got to be some tangible changes. So we're going to be pushing pretty hard to get that. I will shut up now that Ambassador Rice is here. One quick story I have to say, as I was saying this to someone else. I'm going to tell one story. People may not know this, but we actually worked together many, many years ago. In fact, I take credit in McKinsey for hiring Susan, and she came to McKinsey and views. We work on the world's biggest problems, and I remember coming back to our office and seeing Susan in a brown UPS driver's outfit, looking at me and saying, "What is this?" And we just started work at UPS, and the rule at UPS is you had to drive the truck for a couple of weeks before you could do anything. And so that's my image of you, in spite of all the many grand things that you do.
Oh my goodness. Good morning, everyone. Morning, Karen, Penny, Dom. Good to see you, and thanks again for that. I just want to say a few very brief words and to greet you on behalf of President Obama, welcome you back to the White House for your second meeting with us here, and to underscore how much we appreciate the good and hard work that you're doing. And particularly, you're creating a second round of recommendations for our consideration and action. Since we last got together, we've been quite busy here. Secretary Fox led a delegation with a transportation trade mission to the region in June. We worked closely with Congress to pass on a bipartisan basis the extension and renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act for 10 years. President then made his 4th trip to sub-Saharan Africa at the end of July, visiting Kenya and Ethiopia, the first time an American president, a sitting American president, had visited either one of those countries. And he spoke at the African Union, which was also a first. But a large part of the emphasis of that trip was indeed on building trade and investment ties. In his remarks to the African Union, the President said, and I'll quote, "The most urgent task facing Africa today and for decades ahead is to create opportunity for this next generation." And that's why the work that you all are doing with us is so important. We view businesses, including your own, as open and eager to seize investment opportunities in Africa, and our goal with your help is to make that easier for companies like yours and many others. And that's frankly why the recommendations that you've produced are so valuable. We're going to take important steps and make additional significant commitments through our various programs that are established to support trade and investment in Africa. Trade Africa, your work with doing business in Africa and the Africa Campaign, and next year's Africa U.S. Business Forum, which will really be a nice bookend to the Africa Leaders Summit last year and the President's visit this year. Through Power Africa, we're leveraging the combined tools and expertise of our bilateral and multilateral partners and more than 100 private sector partners to accelerate energy transactions and double access to electricity across the continent. With an initial commitment of $7 billion from the U.S., as you know, Power Africa has now leveraged $43 billion in external commitments. And at this year's Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Nairobi, the President was able to announce a new $1 billion in funding from the U.S. government and the private sector to support entrepreneurs. And many of these entrepreneurs, as you know, will be from Africa, and we're putting particular emphasis on women and young people as the targets of our investment. But obviously we still have, as you know as well as anybody, a great deal of work to do. And part of that work is changing old mindsets and addressing deep-rooted challenges in the investment and security and political environment in Africa. But I think we can agree that we're working together effectively under President Obama's leadership and with good bipartisan support from Congress to enable the United States to redefine how we engage Africa in the early part of the 21st century and to move into an era where truly and not just rhetorically we view Africa as an equal partner and a partner with whom we can do business in every sense of the word. So we know that that partnership that we are building can only continue to benefit from the extraordinary good work that you're doing, the ideas that you're generating. And I want to just say that we urge you to keep it up. We need what you do. It's helping us a lot, and we look forward to utilizing your best thinking as we try to strengthen and deepen this relationship with Africa. I wish I could stay longer. My original plan had actually been to come towards the end of this and have more of an opportunity to listen and not just talk. But the President will be doing a foreign leader engagement that we've laid on right in that window. And now I've got to run and do the morning briefing of the President, for which I'm not allowed to be late. So I apologize for talking and running. But I did just want to stop by briefly and just reiterate how much we very much appreciate all that you're doing. And no more stories, okay? All right. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually hand it over to Vice Chair Karen to say a few remarks, and then we'll hear from the Secretary, and then we'll get moving.
I'll just have a few brief comments.
Sorry.
Just a few brief comments, starting with echoing some of the comments that Ambassador Rice just made. Also, the comments that we've received from Secretary Pritzker about the important work that we are doing and the urgency with which we need to continue doing this work. It still remains our focus to create jobs in Africa and provide for better lives for those who live on the continent of Africa. We today will talk about a number of items through the recommendations, and it really keeps coming through over and over again that infrastructure is a critical part of what needs to get done, but we also will talk about the funding necessary to get some of the projects in the value chain or supply chain in place. Those items right now are in its second stage. As we were here in April, we've made some revisions to it, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved in helping us get that done. This is a reflection of what partnerships can do, public and private, and we've done a lot of good work, but we have more work to do to create more actionable items that will ultimately allow us to make a difference. It's clear that there is a long period of time within which some of the transformation has to occur in Africa, but we want to be part of taking some of the initial steps to make that happen. I recently had a chance to be in Africa, and when I was here last, I mentioned that I was going to have an opportunity to interact with the YALI professionals, and indeed, we did at Black and Veatch have a leadership development program, and I just want to say that as it relates to young future leaders, the YALI program is generating incredible leadership. So that will be a critical element of the transformation that we'll see on the continent. I also wanted to point to some of the importance of the women leadership in Africa as that being one of the important aspects of what we're trying to accomplish. You know, at Black and Veatch, we provide infrastructure in the form of power. That will be a topic today, reliable power. But the other thing that I think is important to note is that as companies go into Africa, the opportunity to provide skills and knowledge transfer to create the jobs and create the pipeline for the future. So those would be areas that we're going to focus on today, and as has been noted, we will continue to work on the specificity so we can make those actions those items actionable and ultimately make the difference that we want.
Thank you very much. I just remind people too when we're speaking to make sure we push the microphone on because this is being live streamed so people can pick it up. I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Pritzker. I don't think she needs any introduction. I'm not going to go through it again. The one thing I would just say though is one of the many things she does is set a bar for us on impact and tenacity. And so again, and giving us the permission, if you will, to break some glass. And so we appreciate that amongst the many, many other things you do.
I think this is on. Dominic, thank you. Karen, thank you very much for the leadership both of you provide to this group. In the year since President Obama announced his plans to create this council, you have wasted no time. You've identified issues that are the highest priorities and you making actionable recommendations for how to address them, and we very much appreciate that. The report you produced after your last meeting was invaluable when I traveled with the President to Kenya in July. We used your recommendations as a guide, and I was able to push for greater regional cooperation and discuss mobilizing capital for infrastructure investment in my meetings with African officials and business leaders. Before we begin the discussion today of new recommendations, I want to highlight some of the great work of the last 6 months, much of it in response to your initial set of recommendations. Just a few weeks ago, we launched the first Institutional Investor Roadshow in New York. This was one of the Council's recommendations, and I'm pleased to report we had an excellent response to the kickoff. The governments of Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritius, Mozambique, and Rwanda, as well as the African Union, all participated in the event. And I'm really grateful to you here today that were able to join us, and a special thanks to McKinsey and Karamo Capital for your assistance in making the event possible and successful. This launch made clear there's really a shared appetite among both investors and high-ranking African officials for defining and seizing the enormous opportunities for investment in sub-Saharan Africa. The next phase of the roadshow, our goal for the next phase, is to take the roadshow where it belongs, which is to Africa, and to continue the discussions required on transparency, sensible economic and regulatory reforms that are necessary foundations for a more attractive and reliable investment opportunity. That, in conjunction with your recommendations about what to do about an infrastructure center, I think could have a really catalytic impact. Another area where we've made progress is in the cold chain development area. The Department of Commerce, in partnership with the Global Cold Chain Alliance and others, completed an assessment in Kenya earlier this month that examined 4 things: current cold chain systems and infrastructure, the domestic commercial environment for perishable products, human capital development and training needs, and potential business and investment opportunities. Yesterday, in Nairobi, we hosted a symposium to examine the results of this assessment and generate public-private recommendations for action. And today, the team is meeting with a group of U.S. and East African private sector experts and members of the East African governments to develop, to work on developing and taking the recommendations from recommendations into actual outcomes in Kenya. The recommendations we receive will also inform our engagement in this area with the government of Kenya and with the U.S. EAC commercial dialogue. Another area of focus was the perception of doing business in Africa. And the Commerce Department has incorporated several tactics that you suggested to introduce more U.S. companies to business opportunities in Africa. We've also used, in addition to trade missions, blogs, case studies, diaspora outreach, and collaborating with universities. But I just want to highlight 3 trade missions. One that occurred in May, where we hosted a joint trade and investment mission to Tanzania and Malawi with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a first for MCC. In June, Secretary Fox led a Department of Commerce organized trade mission to Mozambique, South Africa, and Kenya. And in September, we hosted the largest ever trade mission in Africa in conjunction with our signature Trade Winds Conference in South Africa. More than 100 U.S. companies participated, and our delegation visited 8 countries in total. So these trade missions give U.S. companies a firsthand view of the market and connect our leaders to potential buyers, distributors, and joint venture partners. We've made significant progress in the last 6 months, and later in the meeting you'll hear from my interagency colleagues about more successes that have been based on your recommendations. There is one recommendation in particular we've been grappling with for the past few months, which is the U.S.-Africa Infrastructure Center. And I look forward today to hearing more thoughts on this recommendation. We want to make sure that that in considering the implementation of that we can be effective. And the other thing that we want to make sure is, in considering this, that we make sure that our commercial service teams have the necessary tools and training to support an infrastructure effort. And I fear in a resource-constrained environment that we actually scope what we're trying to do in a way that the government can play the unique role it can play, and yet we're partnering with the private sector to make real outcomes. And so I think this is an area that we need a little bit more conversation. I hope we'll do more of that later today. I'll just close by reiterating what Dominic said. First of all, thank you. Second, we focus on the fact our time is short, and so we're halfway through the council's term, And we want to make sure that we prioritize your recommendations and focus on where we'll have the highest return and most actionable. And yet, we don't want to sacrifice the long run. We're not just looking for quick wins. We're also looking to lay down a foundation for continued success in Africa. So I thank you all for the advice you've given us today, the guidance you've given us over the first year of your term. And I really look forward to the continued partnership with this group.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary, for those opening remarks, and also just the impact that's occurred since the last time. That's very energizing for the group. I'm not sure if Ambassador Froman is here, so I'm going to suggest we go through, and when he comes, we'll take a break. The first bucket of sessions we're going to look at now are on infrastructure, and Jay Ireland from GE is the one who's chairing that group. Included in that is the Infrastructure Center, as you mentioned. So over to you, Jay. And again, we've got 20 minutes to go through quite a meaty set of recommendations here.
Thanks, Dominic. I'll talk about on infrastructure. We have three areas: energy infrastructure, the Infrastructure Center, which I'll turn over to Karen to speak on, and then health systems, which Dow will address. I will be talking about the energy infrastructure, and I think, you know, the key thing for development in Africa is going to be a continued improvement and investment in energy, and it's a combination of access and availability. Access is getting energy to as many people as possible, but the key thing from our perspective is going to be availability, which means that there's enough power for people to invest in manufacturing facilities, assembly facilities, retail investments, et cetera. So I think that's going to be a key thing. Some of the issues that we see in Africa around the energy infrastructure area is really understanding supply and demand, and making sure that we have the capability to provide the needed solutions. So one of the thought processes from the council was an aspect of aggregating demand. So not just talking about what the overall demand might be in a country. It could be from a standpoint of, can we pool, let's say, industrial parks, private sector players, to understand what their demands might be needed, and then tailor solutions around that. Part of this is to really highlight what the continued demand will be, not just from a broad standpoint of GDP growth, et cetera, but it'll also provide, ironically, support and some confidence into people that want to invest in Africa, or in some of these facilities, but don't trust the security of supply of energy. So if we can put that together, kind of do a matchmaking from that standpoint, I think it would be helpful. And then provide a roadmap and education for U.S. companies as they do want to invest, and what they need to think about from an energy perspective. I think the key thing on that is also from an energy investment standpoint, especially talking about capital, is to have credible off-takers. And the credible off-takers could be smaller private sector things like I just mentioned, but most importantly, it's going to be around a lot of the utilities, and making sure that they have the strengthening capability to really provide a bankable project, so to speak, as far as a bankable off-taker. So I think it's going to be a big push in improving that capability as well. And so, and working with them and making sure they understand what the potential might be from a standpoint of continued investment in their countries. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is doing a big project in Ghana right now around the utility, which I think is very important from a standpoint of collections, regulatory structuring, et cetera, which I think will, again, increase the bankability of that utility and the capability of providing more energy into Ghana. Another key thing in energy is early stage project development. And this is one where, again, the aspect of getting capital into a project once it's come to financial close, from a debt standpoint as well as equity, is really not that difficult. It's really in the early stage that's really a problem, and because that's where the most risky capital is. You want to keep going? Okay. So from that standpoint, the thought process is, can we aggregate a number of projects, and then tied into that is some of the financing that might be available from some pooling of agencies, funds, et cetera, that could help catalyze some of that area as well. Another key one is, again, in the capital area, is going to be investment guarantees. Partial risk guarantees around off-takers from the World Bank, some of the African Development Bank, some of the other development institutions is going to be absolutely critical in making sure that we really drive the capability from a standpoint of providing security, if you will, some security and credit enhancement to project developers as well as project financiers, which will help them get over the hump, if you will, in making sure that they do the appropriate amount of investment. And then finally, it's going to be pulling together, I think, somewhat of a playbook from a standpoint of Empower Africa has done a little bit of this, but what are the available mechanisms, not just from a U.S. agency standpoint, but also from a standpoint of some of the development banks, et cetera. And I think that's going to be a critical piece as well, and it'll tie into, again, somewhat of a roadmap or a book that we can really show people as far as what are the potential things to get done. And then the final comment I will make is, and this is one that's very difficult from a company that invests pretty heavily in the energy sector and has a lot of businesses aligned to that. Transmission and distribution is going to be the weak link. And we can generate all the electricity, but if we can't distribute it and get it transmitted to where it needs to be, it's going to be absolutely critical. In Nigeria today, we have customers that 50% of their generation capacity is idle, not because they can't generate, it's because they can't distribute it. And that plays back into the financial modeling that they did as far as, they were hoping to do 300 megawatts, they're only doing 150, so the aspect of paying back the investment, et cetera. Now, the issue is that transmission and distribution is typically an area that the private sector fundamentally won't touch. So it's going to have to be really a focus around working, I think, governments and development finance capability to really address a lot of the situation that's there. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Jay. So we're just going to take the chance to interrupt the session. We'll get on to the Infrastructure Center with Karen in a second, but we have Ambassador Froman here, and it's very timely because I think you played an instrumental role in the Power Africa piece, and we're just getting into the detail on the energy side. I don't think you need any introduction either. Glad you look like you've had some sleep since the TPP deal was put through, and again, huge congratulations, and we're very, very happy about that. But we'd love to hear your thoughts as we think about Africa and what we could be doing.
Well, thanks very much, and I apologize for being late, as Penny knows, getting stuck across that driveway between here and the building next door. Seems to be sometimes a moat that's hard to cross, so got stuck on the other side of that for a while this morning. Well, thanks for letting me come. It's obviously an interesting time in trade policy development, with TPP getting done, with TTIP continuing to progress. But one of the things I'm most excited about is the renewal of AGOA that we saw earlier this year, and many of you played a critical role in that. This is a 10-year renewal. It's the longest renewal in AGOA's history. It's a somewhat reformed AGOA in terms of making it easier for our African partners to export goods to us using the rules of origin. It also calibrates the review mechanism so that when there are issues that arise, it's not an issue of turning on or off AGOA benefits, but we'll be able to dial them up or down depending on how serious the challenge is. And we're in the midst of such a review right now with regard to South Africa, as I think many of you know. But it really is an important next step in our relationship with Sub-Saharan Africa. Heading into the renewal, we spent about a year studying the experience with AGOA and then making a series of recommendations coming out of that. And one thing that became clear, and again, many of you had input into this process, is that tariff preferences, while important, aren't enough. It really goes to how can we encourage the use of the tariff preferences by exporters in sub-Saharan Africa. And that goes to everything from having a strategy, a country strategy of utilization of AGOA, to dealing with trade capacity issues and making sure we're addressing those, to dealing with trade facilitation and infrastructure issues. I mean, we know it's hard to have a real bona fide light manufacturing sector in sub-Saharan Africa that can take full advantage of AGOA if you don't have reliable sources of affordable energy. And that's where the nexus between Trade Africa, AGOA, Power Africa all come together. So we're very focused on that with our partners internally and in the interagency effort. We've been looking at how to mobilize resources on trade capacity building across the different agencies in their various areas of expertise. We're working with the countries, the AGOA partners, on their utilization strategies, identifying what their trade capacity needs are. You know, and I'll give an example. There's great potential to expand agricultural exports from sub-Saharan Africa to the U.S., but they've got to meet our sanitary and phytosanitary standards. And that means investing in laboratories in these countries or investing in technical assistance so that farmers can meet those standards and make it more easy to take advantage of the market access we've provided. So we'll be very focused on that in terms of implementing AGOA. But equally important, and this was a major theme of the AGOA forum that we just had in Gabon in August, equally important is what comes next. And there's a real desire, and I think a real robust dialogue about how do we move this relationship to make it a deeper relationship, but also a more permanent and reciprocal relationship. And we're launching that work right now. It's actually part of the AGOA bill, and Flory and our team at USTR, working with the interagency, will be launching that effort to look at what are the options. You know, are there countries that are ready to do a version of a free trade agreement with us in the future? Are there new models of deepening the relationship beyond just preference programs? Certainly AGOA was never meant to be permanent, and we made that clear, and the 11 members of Congress who came to Gabon as part of the AGOA forum made that clear, that they shouldn't count on future renewals of AGOA, that this is a period where we should take note of how much change has happened in sub-Saharan Africa, how much development has happened over the last 15 years, and how their relationship with other major trading partners like the EU has evolved over the last several years, and take that into account as we define our pathway forward. We go into this without any preconceptions or prejudices. We are open-minded as to what form this next path might take, and we're going to be reaching out to a lot of stakeholders here and in Africa to get their input, and I hope that we can count on this group as well to give us your honest assessment of different ways of thinking about what is it businesses are looking for when they either want to source from the region, want to invest in the region. Some of you are some of the most active in sub-Saharan Africa, and what can we do? How can we use our trade policy to help move the relationship in that direction?
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. So, Jay, do you want to continue on?
The other aspect that I should have mentioned, which I think is an important one, domestically at least, is, you know, again, a continuing reauthorization of two key financing pieces, which is EXIM and OPIC. And I think those are key for us from a standpoint of implementing some of these recommendations. So I'll turn it over on the infrastructure to Karen Daniel, talk about it from.
Secretary, did you have a comment? No. Oh, okay. So I'm going to talk about the U.S. Infrastructure Center, or the Africa Infrastructure Center, that's been discussed a lot in the last several months, and then more recently, in the last day or so, we've had a lot of interesting dialogue about the Infrastructure Center. The objectives, as we thought about this Infrastructure Center, is to give some additional help and support to, in this case, West Africa. When we started, we were looking more broadly. There are other activities that are going on the continent where there's been some traction around the connectivity required to expand into some of the markets and then integrate those markets between American companies and African businesses. So as our work was getting done, we felt it was important, as Secretary Pritzker said, we have limited resources to support this activity, but it is an important piece of how we can expand into Africa. The group decided that it was best that we take a look at West Africa, Nigeria being included in that part of it. Nigeria is a very large opportunity. There are a number of issues and barriers to consider when one's trying to do work in Nigeria. What we really want to do with the Trade Center or Infrastructure Center is to, again, create the connectivity as we go around here in the United States and on the trade missions and so forth. We hear that there is a need for businesses to connect. And so we're looking for ways to create what would in effect be what you would consider like a clearinghouse that allows businesses to understand what's going on in that region of the world, and then how to do business. One of the things that we hear often is that it isn't clear, it's at least challenging, it's not very difficult to really understand how to do business in certain parts of Africa. So that's one of the areas that we want to focus on, is how do we get people connected. But in addition to that, there are other aspects of it that we need to focus on. We have focused on this West region, but we also said we need to think about what are some ways to prioritize the activities. So we have focused on 6 sectors, and they have to do with the health systems, which will be talked about here in a few minutes from Dow. We also are looking at transportation, how to move goods between countries and so forth. The reliable power has been talked about a number of times. There are several areas where we can really offer benefit to those who are trying to do the business there. We need to be more specific, and as we think about that, how we can do that, one of the suggestions is that we use the commercial services teams to help businesses understand how to connect and how to do business. As has been pointed out, though, there needs to be some additional expertise provided to those resources. So one of the areas that we need to pursue and consider some more specific actions would be around, do we have the opportunity to partner? Some of the private sector provide some of the expertise that it takes for us to make that connection work. The other area that I think we need to pursue more deeply, and that would be on our upcoming trip, better identification of what some of the issues are and how we might then go back and prioritize those activities. And are there other places on the continent, we were talking about Rwanda earlier, that we might consider as part of this? But the general thinking right now is we need to take on the activity that would allow us to capture one of the big areas, make it work, create it as a platform, and then allow it to be the example that could be replicated in other countries. So the focus has been on Nigeria and West Africa. We'll learn more as we go around and get some additional information. It was discussed in the recommendations about conducting surveys to, again, better identify some of the areas of need. There is also more work to be done in terms of what does this look like 5 years from now? And again, understanding that we won't be working necessarily on those recommendations at that point, but that will help bring about some of the specificity that we need to move this one forward. And while there's a lot more work to do, again, as I said earlier, I think it's one that will have a significant impact in allowing American businesses and African businesses to come together and do critical work.
I really appreciate all the work that's been done in this particular area. And I know, but I want to just register, I remain really concerned that the proposal's too broad and is unrealistic to achieve in a time when we have limited resources. And our commercial service officers do have other responsibilities besides just servicing this. So I hope that you will refine this recommendation. 6 sectors, clearinghouse, Nigeria, I'm worried about the scope of what you recommend. And time is a bit of the essence because our senior commercial service team in Africa is going to meet next week in Cape Town, and part of their agenda is to focus on your recommendations. And so in order to develop an initial plan, and right now I would say they may find it very difficult to take this recommendation and figure out how to make it actionable. So I would ask the group to huddle maybe and refine this into something that is perhaps more bite-sized as a way to start.
So Dom, do you want to talk about how today we'll have, Dominic mentioned we have these items on your desktops there. And one of the additional benefits that we want to get from this scoring, if you will, is to also get some commentary back from the agencies and the council members on how we can either make this more actionable into bite size. So we'll do that as we make our way through the rest of the day.
No, definitely. Thanks, and thanks, Secretary. That's great input as we want to make these actionable and doable. Jay, over to you.
Yep, thanks, Karen. And then one of the other key things we talked about last time and had some recommendations was in the health system strengthening, and Dow Wilson will.
Yeah, thank you. We wanted to build on our previous recommendation from April, and that was there's been a number of programs that we've funded that have been, from a U.S. government point of view, that have been disease-specific, Ebola being the most recent. And these have been great mechanisms, and there's funding available, but they haven't fully been used, and they haven't fully reinforced or built a local primary care infrastructure in Africa. So with that being, we think, a very important objective, whether it's infectious or non-infectious disease, building that kind of primary care infrastructure is very, very important, and therefore tying funding to healthcare system strengthening is a big deal. There are two bills currently in the House and in the Senate that are being drafted to strengthen global health systems and coordinate U.S. government resources. I think it'd be very helpful for the administration to weigh in and support those two bills. We'd also like to see the administration create an interagency task force, including USAID, CDC, HHS, and Commerce, really focused on, can we pick 5 countries and we help do a health assessment in those countries to see what the needs really are, identify the gaps, review the infrastructure and workforce needs. One of the things that we said last night would be very germane here. One of the things we do better than anybody in the world is education and training. This could be a very good area for collaboration. We could partner with the host country ministries, who are very anxious to do this, by the way. That was very evident as we met with healthcare ministers last year at the Africa Leadership Conference, and work with them to prioritize projects and needs, and then identify areas where we can work with the U.S. government to improve collaborations. We'd also like to continue to engage the export and commercial agencies of government with the private sector to provide U.S. solutions to the market. Tying back to what Karen just said, strikes us that there's an opportunity to do that. A lot of the governments are trying to figure out how to do PPPs and just basic how to get involved with some of these more complex trade aspects, and working with Commerce, OPIC, Trade and Development Agency, USAID, DCA, and others to identify payment options. Speaking as a mid-cap company, one of the things that we've learned in this process is just how much out there is available, and a lot of companies, especially smaller companies and mid-sized companies, are not always aware of, U.S. companies are not aware of these financing, technical assistance, or grant funding opportunities. And then to collaborate with private sector firms with the expertise in providing a technology infrastructure, et cetera, to fulfill the needs. So that's kind of the basic overview of what we see as really a great opportunity to meet basic human needs and build really critical primary care infrastructure upon which we can build then the rest of the healthcare infrastructure over many, many years in Africa.
Thanks, Dow. And so you see, I think two of the key infrastructure areas are energy, which is going to be key in power to again, increase economic development, and then health. The health system area is also another one. And we think, again, we take your words, Madam Secretary, on the infrastructure center, which we'll do. And then I'm looking forward to the financial discussion, because without money, none of this isn't going to happen.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we shift? I just had a quick one on the healthcare. In terms, again, of focus or areas, are there any particular parts of the continent that you think we should be focusing on more than others? Or
You know, I think it's a part of the discussion that we need to deep dive. You know, clearly Nigeria is a big long-term opportunity. Having some short-term challenges, kind of figuring out how to mobilize Nigeria. But when you look at Western Africa, especially in terms of primary care, and you know, with the scare we had last year around Ebola, and you know, I think the opportunity is, you know, as I said at the beginning, and as we pointed out in April, a lot of our disease site specific activity has not enabled a primary care infrastructure, and if we build that good primary care infrastructure, it's going to help us across any disease site and in non-infectious disease as well. And that's got to be one of our big long-term goals, especially in Western Africa.
Thank you. I just wanted to come in really quickly on this. We at Treasury are beginning an initiative with some of our colleagues at the State Department and PEPFAR to focus on the financing side of the healthcare. And really what we're looking at is how do we get governments across Africa to begin to devote more resources more effectively at healthcare. All too often, as you said, we've had disease-specific interventions. Governments have become used to that. They're used to donors picking up and engaging on that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've seen this lack of a strong primary healthcare basis. So we're beginning to engage with them, and we should probably talk about maybe some of the countries. We're initially looking at engaging with some of the countries where we have had some of the best interactions on PEPFAR and HIV/AIDS, knowing that that's a disease specific, but where that depth of on-the-ground knowledge is. So we're going to try and bring together the finance ministries with the health ministries. As you said, you've got really good uptake from the health ministries, but what we've learned is the finance ministries are completely disengaged. And for this to be sustainable and to provide an ongoing support for healthcare across the countries, we need to get the finance ministries to begin mainstreaming this in their budgets. Thank you.
Totally agree.
take one more, and then I think we should.
Sure, just quickly, just to say that CDC, USAID, DOD, State Department, many others are working on a global health security agenda initiative, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It is not disease specific. It is really about building core capacity and infrastructure in laboratory surveillance systems, biosafety, biosecurity, across the gamut to really strengthen health systems in countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and around the world. I think that would be a really good place to start. We're doing independent assessments as part of that process, and that is not a U.S. government-led, but a multi-country-led effort to evaluate countries based on their capacity to respond, prevent, and detect infectious disease threats. So I think that would be a good place to start looking at if you pick 5 countries, potentially tying to the countries that we've selected for that effort. Thanks.
One last comment, we should move to the capital markets.
Thank you. Just a quick comment on the infrastructure piece, and to Secretary Pritzker's comment on being focused, and just noting that there might be some way in which we can take the comments on leveraging strategies that already exist to heart, in that some of our agencies, EXIM, OPIC, and USTDA, along with state, have centers in Johannesburg, and we've done the same thing in Bangkok. So there might be some synergy there where we can build on that. And then secondly, to talk about, very briefly, once, as Karen mentioned, we focus on how to do business, just ensuring that we also focus on maintaining and creating the environment in which once the skills are up and running, businesses then can move forward successfully. I think of the Global Procurement Initiative to help level the playing field for US firms, and then things like standards and focusing on industry-led standards, which will make it helpful and useful for US company innovators to be successful. Thank you.